Hello and welcome everyone on this official platform of Legacy IAS Academy. पूरी लेगेसी आईएएस की टीम से आप सभी को हैप्पी इंडिपेंडेंस डे 15th August 1947 the day India broke free from centuries of foreign rule. A nation was born, but so were the doubts. The world saw us as fragile, a new country torn by partition, with a broken economy and hostile neighbors. Many believed that we would not last a decade. But what happened next? That shocked them all. In just one lifetime, India went from a struggling post-colonial state to a decisive player in power politics. From knocking politely on the world's door to sitting at every important table now. This is the untold story of how India's diplomacy or India's foreign policy have been evolved. From the moral idealism of Prime Minister Nehru's non-alignment to the razor-sharp multi-alignment of today. A journey of principles and pragmatism, of victories and mistakes, of moments where and when we were the voice of justice, and moments what we learned that justice alone doesn't keep you safe. So stay with me, because once you see how this transformation happened from the Korean War to the formation of BRICS, from the Green Revolution to the Quad, you will never look at India's foreign policy the same way again. So let's try to understand this scenario, this evolution of India's foreign policy from 15th of August, that is the date of independence. Now 15th August 1947, for India this was more than a date. It was freedom after centuries of foreign rule, the power to decide our own future, the right to make our own mistakes. Now the chances to chart our own destiny. But for the rest of the world, it was a question mark. A new country, a broken economy, a bruised people, and a partition land. Would India even survive? The answer took decades. But in one area, India moved quickly. That is diplomacy. That is foreign policy. Right after the independence, the Cold War came, which was a very shocking incident. And Cold War knocking two superpower blocs, US, which was led by capitalistic camp, and the Soviet Union, which was a communist camp. Now these things were pulling, now these camps, you can say, they were pulling countries to their side. Now what was India's answer? India's answer was, thanks for the invitation, but we'll try to stay out of it. And that is where began our non-alignment movement, or NAM you can say. Now diplomatic meetings, as you can see here, were started in the 1950s. Now for the first time in March 1947, even before the independence, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru hosted the Asian Relations Conference in New Delhi. Around 28 Asian countries attended that conference. What was the goal? The goal was Asian unity. As Prime Minister Nehru added another principle, that is neutrality in our foreign policy. He wanted that Asia to stay out of Cold War politics. And then you'll see 1955, which is very important. Now why 1955 is important? This is something which is related to Bandung Conference. Ji haan, Bandung Conference 1985, which is something related to Bandung Conference. So let's try to understand. In 1955, India played a key role in Bandung Conference, that is in Indonesia. And this time, African nations joined too. Around 29 countries representing more than the half of world's population. And the seeds of NAM were firmly planted. Now some critics called it as fence sitting or isolationist. But India's leadership was clear. We wanted to be players, not pawns. Now then you will see a reality check is going to come in 1960s. Now what was that reality check? We need to understand. To see, in 1950s, India tried to be a global peacemaker, mediating in Korean War, supporting Communist China's UN entry, and also opposing the tripartite attack on Egypt. But 1960s changed everything. Two neighbors attacked us, that is China in 1962, Pakistan in 1965. Now against China we suffered a humiliating defeat. Against Pakistan we won. Now these wars actually taught us that principles win praise but not protection. So economically we were still dependent. Okay, we were still dependent economically during this period. That is, we were importing around 10 to 11 million tons of wheat every year. Har saal hum 10 to million tons of wheat we used to import. That means we were relying heavily on foreign aid for health, education as well as family planning. So when you see the time period from 1955 to 1965, it is considered as the peak. Millions of dollars flowed into India for health, for rural education, for family planning and a whole lot of things. And this dependence actually tested our non-alignment. Now during this period, a Vietnam War was also started in Southeast Asia where US was also involved and USSR was also involved. It was considered as a proxy war between the superpowers and the center was Vietnam. So in this Vietnam War, we criticize United States of America's action, but Washington used aid as a leverage to soften our stance. So this decade, 1960s, were a harsh lesson. That is, without economic strength, independent foreign policy is difficult. And then comes a very important era, the turn to realism, that is 1970s. Turn to realism. Now, 1960s is a proof of that. How? See, the Vietnam War was heating up in this decade and India was a staunch critic of that war. But we also needed US aid at the same time. So Washington leveraged it. They pressured New Delhi to scale down our criticism. So the 1960s was a decade of realization. That means a sort of reality, okay, reality check for Indian diplomacy. And we learned our lessons because in 1970s we injected a dose of realism. And first came, that is, Green Revolution. India upped its agricultural productivity and by the end of the decade we became self-sufficient in food grains. That means no more foreign dependence for food. And then 1970s era also brought various changes. The Green Revolution made India self-sufficient in food. And another important event is with respect to foreign policy was the signing of Treaty of Friendship with USSR in 1971. Now what was the main scenario here? In 1971, India was facing a huge refugee crisis from East Pakistan, and at the same time US-China closeness was also there. So during this period, India signed a treaty of friendship, of peace and cooperation with Soviet Union, and this was a calculated move and it paid off. Now, it was arguably India's most significant diplomatic agreement of the last century, and this agreement was actually rooted in realism. Now, what happened after this? In 1971, that means in the same year, United States of America was cozying up with China. US Secretary of State, as you can see here, Henry Kissinger secretly traveled to Beijing, and at our eastern border, a crisis was brewing. Pakistan was cracking down on ethnic Bengalis, and thousands were flooding into India as refugees. So, neutrality and non-alignment would not have solved these crises. So, what India has chosen? India has chosen realism. So, with the support of Soviet Union, India won 1971 war, and India also helped in liberating Bangladesh in 1971. And the treaty with Moscow did dilute our non-alignment, but it gave us victory in 1971 as it helped India to liberate Bangladesh. And that whole decade of 1970s was marked by Delhi USSR warmth. We bought all kinds of weapons from them, like fighter jets, supported ships, then surface to air missiles, everything. And this decade, you will see, has actually deepened India-Soviet ties with respect to weapons, trade, and if you see the data, it was around $460 million trade in 1973, and it reaches to $830 million in 1975, that is within 2 years. Apart from this, space cooperation was also there, which includes India's first satellite in 1975. So this decade also saw the rise of space cooperation. We launched our first satellite in 1975, and it was launched at abroad, a Russian rocket by the Soviets. So in many ways, the stars aligned for this partnership. The Soviets were fighting with China, and China was warming up to America. America wanted nothing to do with India. So India and Soviet banded up. This worked in our favor in 1970s, and believe me, India emerged as the most powerful country in South Asia. And then comes regional leadership and missteps of 1980s. Now, this is the next decade. So, in the next decade, that is 1980s, we exercise that power because India became already a regional power in South Asia. India played a key role in setting up of SAARC, which was established in 1985, South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation. It was set up in 1985. India helped to form SAARC, and the idea of SAARC was to foster unity in South Asia region. And of course, India anchored this group, and it confirmed our central role in South Asia. But something happened in the second half of 1980s that actually challenged the centrality down south in Sri Lanka. Now, what was that challenge that we need to understand? That is, Sri Lanka was gripped by a bloody civil war, and Sri Lankan Tamils were fighting for a separate country. India did have a stake in this fight. Why? Because we had millions of ethnic Tamils in South India, and many of them sympathized with their peers in Sri Lanka. So, during this period, New Delhi, that is Indian government, decided to intervene. And finally, as you can see here, in 1987, India signed Indo-Sri Lankan Accord to end the civil war, and India also sent Indian peacekeeping force. But what happened? The mission turned violent, dragging Indian troops into the conflict with Tamil separatists. And by 1990, we withdrew a major diplomatic setback. It was a major diplomatic setback. And that is why we say that 1980s was actually marked by another event also. That is a rediscovery of non-alignment. Apart from this, a rediscovery of non-alignment. What happened? After decades, our ties with China were improving. As you can see here, Rajiv Gandhi visited China in 1985. So this Cold War seemed to be ending. Why? As Russians were stuck in Afghanistan. So New Delhi began exploring its options now during 1980s, mid 1980s. And we began warming up to Americans again. And this actually reset was brought by then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. He visited United States in 1985 and then he visited China also in 1988. Now both these trips set the new stage for a new chapter in Indian diplomacy. A post-Cold War strategy, you can say, for 1990s was already set up in 1980s. So this decade of 1980s was marked by uncharted territories, both for our economy as well as for our diplomacy. So in some ways you can see they were linked. Now the next phase in our foreign policy comes new directions, that is 1990s era. As you can see here, 1991 economic reforms opened India to the global market, and Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. So India needed new partners, plus Soviet Union was also gone. So India had, in 1991, India had actually lost a very powerful partner. So we needed alternatives. Now what were the alternatives? So let me tell you, Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia was growing rapidly at that time, and some of those countries were also called as Asian tigers, and that is how fast they were growing, that is Southeast Asia. And that is why India has launched Look East policy in 1992. And India has become a dialogue partner of ASEAN region. And that same year, we also established open diplomatic ties with Israel. Now, for decades, New Delhi has championed the Palestinian cause. Yet, secret ties with Israel did exist. But in 1992, what happened? They came out in open. And since then, there has been no looking back. That means India officially established diplomatic relations with Israel in 1992. With this, relations with United States of America also improved until our 1998 nuclear test in Rajasthan, that is Pokhran 2, Operation Shakti, that actually triggered American sanctions on India after the test. Now, after India did nuclear test in 1998, Pakistan also tested its own nuclear bombs. Now, after this, what happened? As India entered in 2000 the region was becoming a dangerous place. Why? Because two nuclear armed neighbors and there was no superpower to back us and an economy under sanctions. But as always, we found our way. Now, what was that way? Now you will see in the next phase, that is 2000s era, reset and multilateralism. So let's try to understand this. In the era of 2000s, India's diplomacy in this period was dominated by two goals. Now, what was the first goal? The first goal was a reset with America, reset ties with America. I mean, we had no choice. The US was the unquestionable superpower. That means you had to play the nice with them. The second goal was investing in multilateral forums. That is also very important. So United States reset went along nicely and sanctions were mostly lifted by 2001. Now, the most important thing was US-India nuclear deal. Now here US-India nuclear deal became a central diplomatic goal. Counter-terrorism brought the two nations together after 9/11 attack on United States of America in 2001 and 26/11 attack on India, that is Mumbai attack in 2008. So the shared trauma made both the countries to realize something. That means they were fighting with the same enemy. But even as the US ties deepened, India was not going along, which means the legacy of non-alignment remained. And of course, Russia was a shadow of its former self. So we looked elsewhere at blocs. So in this scenario, India had invested in multilateral forums, that is BRICS. BRICS, which was born in 2009 with Brazil, Russia, India, China and later South Africa has also joined in 2010. So our economy was booming. Our diplomacy was diversified. So the era was changing. Now the next era comes, that is 2010s, the era of expansion and rivalries. So just try to understand, clearly it was India's time to shine now. The question was, would we seize the moment? And the last decade answered that question. That is, we most definitely did. India had signed various strategic partnerships like with Israel, UAE, Japan, South Korea, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, etc. India signed various strategic partnership agreement with different countries in the era of 2010s. And it tells you how wide engagement has been now. The last decade also sharpened the rivalry with China. Now, how it sharpened the rivalry with China? The most important thing, Xi Jinping took over as a president of China in 2013. He is relentlessly chasing Chinese supremacy and this puts China on a collision path with India. Now, China's rise under Xi Jinping, it had brought friction. That is the most important example like Doklam standoff in 2017, which lasted over 70 days, which brings us to the ongoing decade 2020s. Now, what is the next decade, that is, which is going on, the decades of 2020s, the era of multi-alignment. So we are seeing India take its rightful place in the world. Now, the vision of India is to become a Vishwa Bandhu, which means a friend to all. And we have moved from non-alignment to multi-alignment. India has shifted from non-alignment to multi-alignment, as you can see. We are in the Quad along with US, Japan, Australia, with everything. And we are in, at the same time, India is also in the BRICS with China and Russia. We engage with G7 and we also lead Global South. India is a voice in G20, Global South. And we are also building ports in Iran, infrastructure in Iran. At the same time, we are also buying arms and ammunition from Israel and still maintain ties with Russia and Ukraine. So this has been the feature of India's diplomacy. This has been the feature of India's diplomacy, India's new diplomacy. Be in every room, but only in your corner. And this is a big shift from the past. Earlier, India's diplomacy was a balancing act. Now we are the balance. And to achieve that, India has changed one crucial thing. What was that thing? That thing is the difference. We are no longer dependent on aids. That is the mistake that we have made it in the 20th century. Now we wanted an independent foreign policy, but our economy at that time could not support it. So decades later, we are in a position to correct that. And today, we actually do not depend on foreign aid. And on the contrary, we are a global order. We are a global donor. So since 2000, India has donated over around $48 billion to 65 countries. And during COVID-19, we have sent vaccines to around 160 nations. That is also a fact. In disasters, whether earthquake, tsunami or piracy, India is the first responder. Whether it is earthquake or tsunami or pirate attack, India is the first to respond. And in 1947, the world looked at us with a doubt. Okay. But today they look at us with hope. So India was non-aligned because it is wise. In 1947, the world doubted us. They took, and today they are looking to us for the leadership. So India's foreign policy began with balancing between the power. And today, India is the balance. And the story is still being rewritten. That is, in 1947, they asked, will India survive? Today they ask, what will India decide? That is the change from 1947 till 2025. We began our diplomatic journey trying to balance between giants. Today, India is the balance. We talk to Washington and Moscow in a same week. We stand with the Global South and we also shake hands with the G7 countries. That is also a fact. Okay. We build port in Iran. At the same time, we are also sending vaccines to Africa, importing arms and ammunition from Israel. We are also patrolling in the Indian Ocean, not because we have to, but because the world expects us to. So this is more than a foreign policy. This is the story of a nation learning that real independence is not just freedom from foreign rule. It is freedom from foreign dependence also. And the journey is not over, my friends. The 21st century will bring new crises, new power shifts, and new choices. But one thing is clear, India is no longer just part of the story. India is actually shaping the story. So, on this Independence Day, I wish you all a very happy independence. Thank you so much.